Falcha, welcome back to part 8. I hope this isn't the light is a little weird. I'm going to try this. I can see my pages, that's what matters. So we're part 8, chapter 20, Born to be Wild, Johnny K, K-A-Y. And we have another pithy quote. I have an explosive temper if someone aggravates me. I've been known to put my fists through 1 or 2 walls. Steppenwolf vocalist Johnny K. John had a hell of a temper when he was doing drugs. Steve Palmer, a member of one of the many incarnations of Steppenwolf. So Joachim Fritz Kraladaut, born the 12th of April, 1944 in East Prussia. He was born in an area that was divided up. It was pre- and post-World Wars between Germany, Belarus, and Poland. So hard to say what he would be considered. His dad was in the army in 1936 and sent to the Russian front. The last time his family saw him was Christmas of 43, and he died sometime soon after that in the Russian front. Luck was on her side, his mother. She got a permit to leave the area, and right after they left, it was badly bombed, so they escaped that. She went to the country and ended up on the right side, the correct side of the Berlin Wall in Arnstadt, and a friendly family took them in. There wasn't a lot of detail. I'm assuming they must have known them, or maybe they befriended them. I don't know. She had this newborn, and in August of 1950, she married a guy who was a POW and a mason, as in brick builder kind of mason. She seemed, it seems like they had a privileged home. Johnny K did. They had a good home. He went to private schools. They had money. They traveled freely to East Berlin. They didn't seem to be affected by the Cold War travel limitations. In 58, they went to Canada to be with family who were already there, and he was renamed John K. He learned English, and he was really into Little Richard. He got a guitar. He got amps, a speaker, an electric guitar. He got all set up. His parents in April of 63 went to Buffalo, New York. He stayed in Toronto to finish high school. His dad started an import-export business. They then went to Los Angeles, and his mom eventually got a job. She became the manager of a large department in Bullock's department store, which is fancy. It was fancy. His dad worked for the German consulate as a chauffeur between 64 and 78 and said it was his dream job. He met Morgan Cabot, who managed a coffee shop and was the son of Frank Cabot, a screenwriter. He was also the godson of Dorothy Rothschild Parker, who lived at the Garden of Allah Apartments in Laurel Canyon. Dorothy Parker, the writer. Kay slept on her godson's floor in Laurel Canyon and he had gone to high school with Lowell George. All these connections. And he was close to Vito Polikas, the freak. For whatever reason, the gathering of strays, he suddenly went back to Toronto and got Gordon Lightfoot, Joni Mitchell, and Neil Young, gathered them up and convinced them to move to LA. He joined a group called the Sparrows, who morphed into the Minor Birds with Rick James, and they got money from Canada's royal family, the John Cray Eaton estate, like Eaton department stores in Canada, and they're worth $2 billion in the 60s. They're worth a lot of money. Neil Young and Palmer went off to LA and had that meet cute with Stephen Sills. Kay married Jutta Maui, a German refugee in Toronto, and eventually returned to Los Angeles, but they didn't have any luck. Their visas were expiring. A guy told him, well, why don't you, get a contract, put a band together. So he got guys together and called it Steppenwolf after the Hermann Hesse novel. And he got a contract with ABC Dunhill, just like that, 1, 2, 3. And the band members called him the Fuhrer because he was very controlling. He fired nearly everybody in the band eventually. He had no original members, and he also fired their substitutes. They rehearsed in the summer of '67 and made their first album in December. On April 14th, in 68, so about 4 months later, they appeared on American Bandstand. And in March of 68, he had a daughter, Shawn, Shawn. The week before the band was beamed into America's living rooms, Judah gave birth to what would be Don Kaye's only offspring, Shawn Mandy Kaye. Growing up, Shawn's circle of friends and classmates would include Carney and Wendy Wilson, daughters of Beach Boy Brian Wilson, John Phillips' daughter China, Zappa offspring Moon Unit and Dweezil, Ethan Brown, the son of Jackson Brown, and Phil Spector's son Dante. Shawn Kaye would later recall that she was intimidated by her father when she was young, adding that when he was around, there was a certain amount of tension in the air. He got the other songs that he played, in their group from Hoyt Axton, who lived in Laurel Canyon and was the son of a naval intelligence officer. Shockaroo. They got a big hit with Magic Carpet Ride, and that was written by band member Rushton Morive, and he was the boyfriend of Aldous Huxley's granddaughter. Oh my God. He was killed in a motorcycle accident July 1st, 1981 in Santa Barbara. The music on Easy Rider got them more notice. It was good advertising. And in 72, they retired the band. They tried to reform 2 more times. They joined with the Guess Who in 87 and in 1990 and in 2006. Gabriel Meckler was their producer, but he died in a motorcycle accident in July of 77. And then drummer Jerry Edmonton died in a car crash in 93. So they just couldn't keep band members. It kind of makes you wonder, like, what were they under the influence of when they were driving around? I don't know. I'm just wondering. Chapter 21, A White Shade of Pale, Arthur Lee and Love, the band Love. Now, I listened to them. They were good. I listened to all these bands. I didn't know a lot of them. And so I went on YouTube and listened to a bunch of them, and they were good. So we definitely started what became the hippie movement, and it spread from there up to Haight-Ashbury and the Fillmore in San Francisco, and then all across the nation. This is Arthur Lee. Arthur was the whitest black guy I ever knew. He didn't live the black lifestyle, always liked the white way of life, and liked white girls. This is producer Skip Taylor. I believe, if I'm not in error, that he was actually biracial, or his mother was. I can't remember. So his name was Arthur Porter Taylor, born March 7th, 1945 in Memphis, Tennessee. His mother was biracial. She passed as white. Very interesting situation. He was a huge authoritarian. He had an Aunt Vera who got him hooked on cigarettes when he was 3 and who later died of rat poison. In 1952, he went to LA, and his whole family went to LA, and his mom remarried a guy called C.L. Lee. Lee was a Mason and proud of the buildings that he built. And Little Richard was one of their neighbors. Bobby Day was a Richer. Ray Charles was a neighbor. Ray Charles recorded nearby, and he would stop and listen. He went to high school with Billy Preston and Mike Love. They were friends. Arthur had money, a TV, recording stuff, instruments. He had a better quality of life than a lot of the kids around him. He was a bit of an athlete. He formed a high school band, and the manager got the song by lying, and what they would do is he would get him jobs by lying. They would get songs, and they would tell people they were the Coasters or they were the Drifters, and they were really good at imitating them, and nobody knew they were just a high school band. So they would get hired for, events, pretending that they were somebody important. In 64, he wrote My Diary, which was sung by Rosa Lee Brooks and played in the back by Jimi Hendrix. He was influenced by club owner Elmer Valentine, who was his father figure. He was fascinated with Vito and the Freaks. He changed the band's name to the Grassroots. He got Bobby Beausoleil as a drummer. He also had Brian McLean and eventually replaced Beausoleil with Brian because they couldn't use both of them. Beausoleil went to San Francisco with Kenneth Anger and the Process Church. Anger was also the son of military intelligence. Bobby shared the stage with Sills Young and Buffalo Springfield. Beausoleil was quite the musician. He returned to Los Angeles and he met Manson in December of '67. Beausoleil was abused by an aunt and uncle. It was bad. It was typical of the worst sexual and other abuse that was brought down on a little kid. This is what a friend said. He appeared in Anger films, and from prison he did the soundtrack for Lucifer Rising. Lucifer Rising was the movie that little boy who died was supposed to be in, Godo. And he met Manson while living with Gary Hinman and Mary Brunner. Mary Brunner had Manson's child. They ran a basement drug lab out of Gary Hinman's house. By 1969, he was living full-time in Laurel Canyon. In July of '69, he and Susan Atkins murdered Hinman. In August of '69, he was arrested 2 days before the Tate murders. Arthur had to change the band name to Love because there was already another group called Grassroots. And in 1966, they were signed to the Elektra label. Between 1950 and 1955, they had over 1,000 new record labels created, and only these two survived, Atlantic and Elektra, begun by a 19-year-old art student in a dormitory at St. John's College in Annapolis, Jack Holzman, with $600, half from his bar mitzvah and half from a classmate's veteran bonus. Anyway, everybody in the band Love was a good musician. They were very good. It was a really good band. Yet another album cover, all of his album covers and many of the other people in Laurel Canyon, it's really weird. Their album covers were all made on the grounds of burnt down houses. So here's another one. At first I didn't write it down, and then it was too much to go back and try to figure it out. But I began to realize, oh my God, another one. And then the book actually says, yet another burned down house. So in June 18th of '66, they were on American Bandstand. The Doors loved Lee and the band Love, and the second album was made in front of filmed the cover in front of a fire-ravaged Laurel Canyon home. They lived in the Tripp house in Laurel Canyon where the movie The Trip was shot. All the members were of draft age and nobody was drafted. Very interesting. Arthur pretended to be gay and the other members didn't sleep or bathe before their interviews, and they thought they were crazy. Band members Heron and band members were into heroin and Arthur was into coke. I can't read my handwriting. He threatened the group by bringing in the Wrecking Crew as a background because they were so into drugs that they couldn't even perform. And it straightened them out enough. It pulled them together to do their album for the last time. In November of '67, they made Forever Changes, and it was regarded as one of the finest albums ever made. In the middle of '68, they broke up due to everybody's drug use. Jimi Hendrix and Lee were in talks to form a new band with Steve Winwood when Hendrix died in September of 1970. Lee and Hendrix both had been past lovers of Devon Wilson, and she was the last person to see Hendrix alive. No relation to the Beach Boys, I don't think. She was the last person to see Hendrix alive, and 5 months after that fell 5 floors out of the Chelsea Hotel and died. So Lee and Morrison both dated Pamela Corson, who was the last person with Morrison, and she died 3 years after Morrison died. So Lee has the dubious distinction of having been with 4 people who all died tragically young within 3.5 years in a circle of friends. He made a number of failed musical attempts in the next years, but he was incarcerated a number of times. He served prison time, mostly drugs, and he finally got out in August of 2006 and died of leukemia. Other Laurel Canyon denizens with odd aerospace ties. Ken Forsey, a member of the band, had planned to go into aerospace engineering. Nancy Pittman, who was in the Manson family, was the daughter of aerospace engineers who designed guided missiles. Squeaky Fromm, who had an abusive authoritarian dad who was in the aerospace industry, and Lee. He was a megalomaniac, extremely authoritarian, manipulative, and had later, it was decided, dissociative disorder. His friends all talked about the fact that there were two Arthurs, that his personality, demeanor, his way of dealing with people could snap in a second. He could go from really, really nice to really scary, awful very quickly, which sounds like borderline personality disorder, but let me go find my license. Chapter 22, Endless Vibrations, the Beach Boys. Speaking of odd, Dennis Wilson was killed by my shadow because he took my music and changed the words from my soul. Who said that? Charlie Manson. Brian Wilson was odd. His eccentricities, according to this book, were the stuff of legend. The Beach Boys were unique. They made their first album before Laurel Canyon. They made their first album before the British invasion. Their image was squeaky clean. If you remember their very first album, they all had short hair and button-up shirts with short sleeves. Their music focused on girls, cars, and surfing. The Monkees are much maligned, and the Beach Boys are also discussed by their peers as, not really part of the counterculture, maybe not hippies enough. They're regarded as not really musicians enough. But the reality is they were revered by the musicians of Laurel Canyon. They were very much welcomed by their peers. Brian Wilson was a godlike figure, regarded as the finest musician, songwriter, producer, and arranger of his era. Quote, Brian was the most highly regarded musician in America, hands down. I believe David Crosby said that. So the Wilsons, in the 1700s, the Wilsons came to New York. In 1804, Henry Wilson was the first American-born member of the family. They were stonemasons in Ohio. In the late 1800s, they moved to Kansas to try farming, and that didn't work very well, so they quit and they went into industrial plumbing, which seems the logical progression. They made money working on construction of state reformatory systems and did well. In 1904, they bought 10 acres of farmland in Escondido, California. But they returned to Kansas plumbing in 1905. And I'm going to make a wild guess here and say that farmland in California was not what farmland in California is today, and which it may not remain for long. This is before the water wars. This is before they brought the water in from the Colorado River, Owens Valley. California was a desert. A decade later, in 1914, his son William Buddy Wilson went back to California. He was moody, scattered, self-destructive, alcoholic, and was into domestic violence. His son, Murray, was born July 2nd, 1917. He hated his dad, and after his mother died, he never saw or spoke to his father again. Now, this is the Wilsons, the Brian, Dennis, and Carl, the Beach Boys. This is their father was Murray. Their grandfather was Moody Buddy. And their great-grandfather was the one who bought the land. So in 1935, Murray, their dad, quit school, got a job in Southern California with the gas company. In 1938, he got married, and they had 3 sons. In 1942, Brian. In 1944, Dennis. And in 1946, Carl. Murray moved from the gas company and eventually started his own industrial equipment rental company in Southgate. He had an explosive, violent temper, according to Dennis. And let's see here what this says. Son Dennis would say that he and his brothers had a shitty childhood. Our dad used to wail on us, that asshole beat the shit out of us. The chronic abuse, he noted, led to both of his brothers being bedwetters into their teens. It was written that on many occasions, Murray's punishments went beyond simple beatings into the realm of the sadistic. It said that Dennis, the most rebellious of the three boys, and therefore the most frequent target of Murray's wrath, was on various occasions beaten with a 2x4 and burned with matches. One particularly savage beating, delivered to brother Brian when he was 2, left him nearly deaf in his right ear. And one needs to wonder about closed head trauma. Murray's sister Emily in 1938 married a guy called Milton Love, who was a sheet metal worker and very wealthy. They lived in a 5,000 square foot villa in the Baldwin Hills. They had 6 kids, and the oldest of which was Mike Love. They were rigid disciplinarians. Brian, after high school, went to El Camino Junior College to study music and psychology. And with his neighbor and classmate El Jardine and Mike, his cousin, they formed the Beach Boys. Dennis was the only real surfer. Nobody else surfed. Their first single was Surfin', which was written on December 8th, published December 8th, 1961. It climbed to number 2 locally and number 75 nationally, which is pretty good for a first song. Brian dropped out of school. He knew what side his bread was buttered on. Dennis was 17 and Carl was 14 when they had that hit. Murray appointed himself the manager, this is their father, and their mother the bookkeeper, so they got glommed their hands onto their money. He formed, Murray did, the Sea of Tunes publishing company to manage Brian's songs and took a controlling interest because, of course, he did. He did get a Capitol record contract, and they became clients of the publicist Derek Taylor. Taylor had been the publicist for the Beatles and then for the Byrds. Brian often collaborated. His number 1 collaborator was Gary Usher, 23. The story is he walked down the street, he heard them in their home studio working on Surfing Safari. He went in and steered them towards car songs and provided them with a lot of their songs about cars. June 4th of 62, they did Surfing Safari with the 409, Usher's song, on the other side. They got a summer tour and a full album contract. They got booked at Pandora's Box, and they negotiated for Brian to be the producer, which was very unusual for a 20-year-old from Capitol Records. He got unprecedented artistic control. They put out 10 albums in 3 years. They also wrote and recorded for others. He met Marilyn Rovell, 14, of the sister act The Honeys. They had a romance. They slept in her family home. His parents were okay with it. She was 14. In 1964, they got their own apartment. Marilyn was 15, and they married at the end of 64. Dennis had an affair with a 16-year-old single mom called Carol Friedman. Carl married at just 16 Anne Hirsch, the daughter of wealthy Filipino casino owner. Mike Love married his second wife, who was 17. So in 68, Dennis had an affair with 15-year-old Diane Adams. Before his death, Dennis married 15-year-old Sean Love, the daughter of his cousin Mike Love. He was 30. She was rumored to be the illegitimate daughter of Mike Love, a first cousin and bandmate. Lyrics of their songs indicate a taste for underage girls. Brian shared with interviewers the disturbing observations about 3-year-old Carney and sexual behavior. These people were perverted. Brian and Marilyn were friends with Lauren Schwartz and Tony Asher from their old high school, Santa Monica High. Asher was the son of Laura LaPlante, and I wonder if that name rings a bell to anybody. If you like silent films, Laura LaPlante was a huge silent film star. This guy was her son, and she had him with the producer, Irving Asher. Asher grew up with Hollywood royalty and wealth. The son did. Schwartz was a former child actor and a friend with Sills and Hillman, Crosby and Mcgowan. They were all into pot and acid together. In 1965, Brian and Marilyn bought a home in Laurel Canyon. Brian was heavily influenced by Phil Spector. He's a great influence. The Wrecking Crew musicians were on most of the Beach Boys recordings. Brian got his hair done by Jay Sebring, who introduced Brian to Satanism and Sammy Davis Jr. Tony Asher collaborated with him on Pet Sounds. Van Dyke Parks collaborated with him on Smile. And he's the son of a Jungian psychiatrist and former child star. His older brother was killed in Germany on secret assignments for the U.S. State Department, a casualty of Cold War intelligence work undercover. Terry Melcher got Wilson and Parks together as a songwriting team. They met at a Cielo Drive Sharon Tate House party. Terry's former duo partner, Bruce Johnson, toured with the Beach Boys. He replaced Glenn Campbell. Glenn Campbell had something interesting to say as a pacifist, peace, love, and war, hippie movement, flower child, musical icon. Campbell, a former member of the Wrecking Crew, was another member of the Laurel Canyon community with curious views on the war and the draft. He told Variety magazine in the 60s that protesters who were burning their draft cards should be hung. Curtains are hung. People are hanged. If you don't have enough guts to fight for your country, you're not a man. Quote, Glenn Campbell. Glenn and Bruce replaced Brian, who didn't like to tour. So Brian would stay home, and if Glenn was around, he would do it, and if he wasn't, Bruce would do it. In 1967, Brian and Marilyn moved out of Laurel Canyon to Bel Air, to the home of Edgar Rice Burroughs of Tarzan fame. Brian was addicted to Desputals, which was a combo drug of meth and phenobarb, which he got from the doctor. It was a prescription. He liked to read Hermann Hesse, and, that led to Johnny Kay's band, Steppenwolf. And followed Subud philosophy, which was inspired by Jim Mcgowan. Now, Jim Mcgowan became Roger Mcgowan, and he changed his name because he belonged to this cult and they told him to change his name. And I did a little research on this cult. I was curious. It's a brand of Sufism. It's a splinter off of Islam. And it's belief, the only thing that they believe that's different from the regular Islam is they believe in ecstatic music and dance and self-expression. So they get together once a week and they do, I believe probably the whirling dervishes might be related to this. It didn't occur to me to check, but they do, they induce a state of ecstatic meditation. They transport themselves, their consciousness, by engaging in song and dance and whatever. Brian Wilson got involved in this. In 1967, 2 weeks before the show happened, they backed out of the Monterey Pops. They didn't think that they would mix well with Hendrix and Joplin. By 1968, they were out of step with popular culture. Brian was trying to form a band around his friend Danny Hutton. Now, Danny Hutton was born in Ireland in 1942, and his family came to the United States, and he did cartoon voiceovers for Hanna-Barbera. He tried out for the Monkees. He made a trio called the Redwoods with Corey Wells and Chuck Negron. Wells was born in 1942 in New York. He had a violently abusive stepfather. Wells joined the U.S. Air Force to get out of high school and relocated to Los Angeles and formed the band The Enemies, which was the house band at the Whiskey A Go-Go. Negron was born in 1942 in New York and was a high school basketball star. He was recruited by a college in L.A. He was addicted to heroin for 20 years, and he did more than 36 stints in rehab. Brian's brothers refused to sign the trio because they were just too unstable. They later became Three Dog Night, one of the most successful recording acts of the era. They made millions. In 1967, Mike Love went to India to see the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He was known for his barely harnessed rage. He was a pretty evil guy. These are quotes. He was like a security guy, like a Secret Service agent. He was militaristic. He was scary. He joined the Beatles Mia and her sister Prudence, Pharaoh, and Donovan at the Maharaji. In 68, Brian was committed and subjected to electroshock therapy and antipsychotics. In 70, Mike Love was committed after a long, high-speed car chase, trying to avoid his father and brothers who chased behind him in other cars. He was straitjacketed and involuntarily committed. In 68, and Dennis has no memory of this, he moved into Will Rogers' house in Laurel Canyon and hosted the Morrisons. He paid living and the Mansons. He paid living and medical expenses for him. He let them use and wreck his expensive cars. He has no memory of any of that, he said. Well, he's dead now, but when he was alive. Through Dennis, Manson had the admiration of, met many Laurel Canyon residents, Terry Melcher, Greg Jacobson, David Crosby, Neil Young. They loved him. Dennis took Manson to Brian's home studio where he met Three Dog Night. And in 68, the White Bee album was released by the Beatles. And it was, a big deal artistically and culturally. Next year, Dennis told an interviewer that sometimes the wizard frightens me. Charlie Manson, who is another friend of mine, says he is God and evil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry. Wilson added that Brother Records would likely be releasing an album by the aspiring singing-songwriter Manson. But Manson, like Three Dog Night, ended up taking his talents elsewhere. Probably just as well for Dennis Wilson. By 1969, Brian was not doing music. He was selling vitamins in a health food store. Can you imagine walking into a health store and buying your vitamins from Brian Wilson? Murray sold Brian's catalog of songs, Sea of Tunes, to A&M Music. Ooh, and Brian got nothing. He got no money from it. The band hired a new publicist, Jack Riley, a huckster from D.C., a very right-wing conservative who had a company called the Stern Concern Organization. Brian was hanging out with Danny Hutton, the guy from Ireland, on Wonderland Avenue, who had a party room with blacked-out windows and piles of coke on the floor. And guess who else hung out there? Ringo, John, Harry Nilsson, Keith Moon, the usual suspects. June 4th, 73, Murray had a heart attack and died. Brian and Dennis did not go to the funeral. Brian had new friends, a guy called Tandin Almer. Almer wrote Along Comes Mary for the Association in 1966. He appeared in 1967 in a CBS special, Inside Pop, The Rock Revolution, which was hosted by, of all people, Leonard Bernstein. It had Zappa, Graham Nash, Roger McGuinn, Brian Wilson. Brian hired Almar to rewrite the lyrics of Beach Boy hits. He hired him for the purposes of taking all of their hit music and changing all the words. Then he decided to stop doing that, and the two tried to write new songs. They did come up in 1973 with Sail On Sailor, and in 74, Almar left LA. He disappeared. Everyone thought he was dead. And then they discovered in 2013 that he had really just died, and he had been a recluse in Washington, D.C., McLean, Virginia. A big mystery what that was about. In June of 74, Endless Summer, the double album, came out. It was all the early hits, and it was a huge hit. It caused more concerts for them. It gave life to their flagging career. Stan Love, Mike's brother, was 6'9", basketball player. He was hired to handle Brian. In 75, Stephen Love, his brother, and their cousin became their new manager. Then Eugene Landy was hired as a handler doctor. He had complete control over his patients' person, professional life, social life, financial lives, sex lives, and he had an army of minions who monitored, recorded, controlled every movement of his patient. Brian was drugged heavily, treated like a child, humiliated by these handlers. His Landy's behavior and fees caused the Beach Boys to fire him after a year. He was replaced by a brawny trio of bodyguards: Stan Love, Rocky Pamplin, who was a football player, and Steve Kortoff, who was a cousin and a Marine. And they hired a new psychiatrist, Steve Schwartz, to replace this other guy who sounds just like an abusive creep. And but as it was revealed, Schwartz did not last long. One day the phone rang and a strange doctor asked Brian to come see him. When Brian arrived at the office, he was told that Dr. Schwartz had been in a terrible camping accident and had fallen off the side of a mountain to his death. Wilson had apparently picked an unacceptable handler. In 1978, his marriage ended. Marilyn accused him of drugging their very young daughters. Brian was put in a psychiatric ward for a number of months. In 78, Dennis made a solo album, Pacific Ocean Blue, which was critically acclaimed. He did it with Greg Jacobson, and that was the guy who was the Manson fan. They were living in Coldwater Canyon with Christine McVie of Fleetwood Mac. In the 70s, it was a 70s Laurel Canyon band with Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. Dennis and Christy lived together for 2 years, and their pool house burned down. A lot of buildings burning down. In 1980, the Beach Boys did a fundraiser concert for George H.W. Bush, the Spy Master General. They played one of Reagan's inaugural balls. Dennis had an affair with Patty Reagan. They played a private birthday party for Bush. In 1980, Stan Love and Rock Pamplin broke into Dennis's house and severely beat him brutally. They left him in the hospital. And apparently they got restraining orders and fines, but apparently they did it to stop Dennis from giving drugs to Brian. But rumor has it they were really sent to warn Dennis to leave Mike Love's underage daughter alone. Sean, the possibly illegitimate daughter. He and Sean married after their son was born in 1983. They had a violent, turbulent relationship, and papers for divorce were filed 4 months later. In December of 28th of 1983, Dennis drowned in Marina del Rey and had been estranged from his brothers at the time. He had 5 marriages in 39 years, fast cars, drugs, and alcohol. Mike Love married 6 times by 1981. Dennis had an affair with not only Mike's illegitimate daughter, but also with his cousin's wife. He was obsessed with sex. As I said, his nickname was The Wood. Ideal companion for Charlie Manson. Manson went to visit Dennis 2 days after the murders on Cielo Drive. In 1983, Landry was back in Brian's life for a full decade, and he made millions off of him. The California Board of Medical Quality Assurance filed charges, and he had to surrender his psychology license, but he continued with Brian as a private business partner. In May of 1990, Stan Love filed to be Brian's legal conservator. This is his cousin. In February of 1992, the court ordered Landry out. In March of 2006, Landry died, and Brian apparently was devastated. In 1995, Brian married Melinda Ledbetter. They adopted 5 children. In December of 1997, his mother died. In February of 1998, Carl died, and Brian was the last remaining Wilson brother. Mike Love kicked out Al Jardine from what was left of the band, and, he wanted to gain control of the band, and Jardine was the only remaining original member. Brian finally, after 40 years, released the album Smile in 2004. He apparently had a serious dissociative disorder. He heard voices, he went into fugue states, he would disappear for days and turn up wandering penniless in Watts or East LA. And while composing, he appeared strangely absent. He would stare fixedly at the wall. He could function less as an artist, and he functioned more like an antenna, it is said. So that is the end of part 8. And we will be back soon with part 9. I'm giving it a go, you guys. I hope this light's not too bad. Thanks for watching. We'll be back.